So there was a scenario coming up inside Unity and Playmaker that I was finding a little bit puzzling, and so I made this demo scene to kind of demonstrate a couple of different things. I have a character controller that I duplicated, and this character controller is set up just like we did in previous presentations. It's a capsule that has a character controller object that's been attached to it. So if I look down into the inspector panel, I can see that I have a character controller component added to my capsule. And to that capsule, I've attached a simple state machine that just has one state that gets the access vector. It stores that into a vector3 variable, and then uses the controller's simple move action to translate that into this environment. So, and that works just fine. That's our typical setup when we're trying to control a third person based on our previous presentations. The thing that I was running into were some issues with collisions. Most of the collision detection that I'm accustomed to inside Unity is a rigid body running into another rigid body, or a rigid body running into an object with a box or some kind of a collider to it, and those collision events are always firing just fine. But the minute that you throw a character controller object component, so that's a component physics character controller, that's functioning a little bit different than a standard rigid body. And you'll see here in this demo scene that there's a couple of different scenarios that are set up. The first scenario is just a simple cube with the trigger activated in the box collider, and that works just fine. And I'll demonstrate how to create that scenario. I'll remind you how to create that scenario very simply, so that you can run a character controller into an object and detect for different, detect for a trigger. The things that don't seem to work are rigid bodies. When you run into a rigid body with the character controller, it doesn't seem to register it as a collision event. And just to kind of put a fine point on that, I have a fourth scenario here where I have a rigid body box cube that falls onto the same identical character controller. And when the cube runs into the character controller, it fires off an event. But when the character controller runs into the cube, it does not consider it as a collision event. So just want to make you aware of that so you can avoid that pitfall. So here's the quick demo. I'll just hit the play button. And notice over here this fourth scenario. The cube falls, it hits the character controller, and then fires off an event that I've set up. And so each one of these cubes are set up to where they have state 1, they listen for either a trigger event or a collision event, and then fire off state 2, and I have it turning on spotlights so I get some quick feedback about what kinds of collisions or triggers are happening. And so again, if I hit the play button here, that first rigid body is running into my character controller, and it works just fine. Now when I move the character controller forward, it seems to interact with the trigger just fine and triggers that event of turning on the light. But when it comes to the character controllers running into objects with rigid bodies, and in this case I have a rigid body with no gravity and a rigid body with gravity, just to experiment with a couple of differences, they don't detect these collisions. So again, if I look at this cube, it's just a simple state that's listening for a collision event. It's the same thing that's going on with this cube here. This cube has a state that's listening for a collision event, and will fire off to state 2. The only difference is that in scenario 2 and 3, it's the character controller that's initiating the collision, whereas in this fourth scenario, it's the rigid body that's initiating the collision. So just something to be aware of, something that I've run into that so you can avoid some of these issues by just being aware of what's happening here. So I'll rebuild this this cube with trigger scenario. It's just very simple, very straightforward. I'll create a cube object and I'll move this into a position that I can run into it. Okay, and I will set that cube. I'll turn its trigger on. With that cube selected, I'll add just a real simple state, and on that state I'm going to listen for a trigger event. So I'll get trigger event from physics, and on trigger enter, I want to collide with an untagged object. So these players do not have any kind of a tag on them. So if I select one of them, you can see that they're untagged. I'll go back to my new box here that I'm creating. And once I get a trigger event I want to fire off a custom event, so I'll call this send. I'll go back to my state and I'll make sure that I'm sending to that event. I'll add another state and add this send transition here. So again, the idea is that this box is listening for a trigger event with an untagged object. When that happens, it's going to fire off this state 2 to send. I'll hit the play button. And you can see that when I run into that object, I'm firing off the state. Okay, so if I want to loop back and get it ready to listen for another collision, we can do that. And then, of course, if you want to fire off any other actions based on, you know, a trigger event happening, and of course you can filter based on tags. So there's a lot that you can do with that, but what you don't want to do, it appears, is to have a character controller running into a rigid body and listen for a collision event. Again, because this cube is listening for a collision event, doesn't seem to want to register that when the character controller runs into it. Same thing with this cube. It's a very similar scenario. I just have a loop set up so that when this falls onto the ground, it doesn't interpret that and get stuck in that fired state. The fourth scenario is the one that I guess I found most puzzling. That these won't work, but if you drop the cube onto the character controller and listen for a collision event, it's going to work just fine. So just a little something I came across and was kind of beating my head against the wall trying to figure out a scenario for this, and that's the scenario. So if you have any questions about that, let me know.